Hi guys, welcome in. My name is Micah Horn, and I'm here with Dawn Apgar. Today we're going to be talking about her article recently published.
My name is Dawn Apgar. I'm a associate professor and director of the Undergraduate Social Work Program at Seton Hall University.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Dawn. I'm super excited
Thanks.
to get into this today.
Yeah.
Firstly, I just kind of want to start off for our listeners who may not know where this article is coming from or what it is about. Can you please just give us like a little bit of a rundown on kind of the work you did and yeah, how it came to be?
Yeah. So the special issue that just came out on licensure disparities obviously was of particular interest to me because I've done a lot of research on the licensing exams. And so I was very fortunate to partner with someone who I've written with before, Mary Nino, and some of her colleagues. And we were interested in taking a look at how states were addressing the disparity issue and whether they were taking, political, like legislative action, what the response was. And so we did a empirical study interviewing NASW directors of different chapters across the country to find out, um, you were changing the exam, whether they were developing alternate pathways, what some of the research that's out there that regarding the disparities, like how they were addressing it legislatively in their states.
Thank you for answering that. I appreciate that. Now, I'm kind of curious. In within, like, just kind of like state legislature and things like that, did you notice, any states having specific kind of like policies or again, just advocacy that stood out to you that were like, "Oh, I haven't heard about this before, seen something like this before," that seemed to pave way for better results or different results? What do you think?
So, yeah, so what was pretty clear in our article is that there was a lot of education that needed to be done. And the NASW chapters, that's why we selected them. And when I say my article, I mean, I just want to acknowledge there were, co-authors too. So it wasn't just me, but the NASW chapter directors spend a lot of time educating legislators about just testing disparities. And so, that was important. And also, another thing that was really important was that a lot of it really came down to the relationships that the NASW chapter directors had in the state. And I think that's really important because again, it really highlights what we know as social workers that, politics is personal. And if you want to make change, you really have to convince people, right, that change is important. And so in states where the chapter director had a pretty big network, they did coalition building, they had relationships and, political capital, they were able to make changes in a more meaningful way than states where maybe the director had changed. They had turnover, or they, were new and they didn't have those relationships. Again, our article, I think, has broader implications than just looking at testing disparities. It's really was meant to also be a sort of case study, if you will, on how to evoke change from a policy perspective. When you're talking about, you know, it's interesting because this is a national issue, but in order to actually make change, it has to be done one state at a time. So, because professional regulation is a state issue. It's not a federal policy issue. And so that also was hard because, different states took different approaches.
I'm kind of curious now as we kind of shift the attention. I know you mentioned a little bit about the people you talked to, the chapter directors for this. And again, just with this having to do with testing disparities between black and brown and POC and their white counterparts, did you see like racial disparities in the chapter directors themselves that you were talking? And what did you kind of
Interesting.
like how did you kinda navigate that? How did that impact the findings, and maybe how did you make sure that, you know, the data represented was still sound and still representative of
Got
the
it.
underrepresented communities?
Yeah. So one thing that is interesting is, and we bring this up in the article, is that NASW as a national organization was really came out and said, that they wanted reform, right, in the test and they, elimination of the test or alternate pathways or whatever. And so I found it really interesting because the national said it, but then again, it has to be passed state by state. So when you think about as social workers, we talk about like street level bureaucrats, it did come down a lot to what the chapters and the chapter leadership felt. So, for example, and a lot of it again came down to was it realistic? Do you know what I mean? In that state. So, because some chapter directors said if they opened that up, that they risked like opening up the licensure laws broadly and that they might lose licensure. You know what I mean? They may not, so it would erode. They were very concerned about that. And that was because of the political landscape. So I think what happens is that, the leadership and the director, I'm just typically, I mean, they maybe, mirror the population of that state. So we didn't control or we didn't look at the race of the director. But what you're alluding to, I think, is important in that, you know what I'm saying, where there maybe was greater diversity in that state, those tended to have constituent and they were maybe more diverse, tended to maybe I wouldn't say care about this issue, but be willing to take some sacrifices. Do you know what I mean? Or take it on. So I don't know that it was the race of the director, but the director is the leader of a board. Do you know what I mean? And a group of social workers. And so, um, uh, we do see more diversity in some political parties than others.
Sure. I like the way you answered that question. I think that was it definitely it definitely helped out with, like, just kind of like what I was thinking about that. So that was a great way to answer that. Yeah, I feel like it is very interesting, or obviously it's just interesting to see that those states with chapter, directors that are more like the people that they're trying to help, it ends up being easier because it's something that they understand. It's something that they
Yeah.
have been through themselves. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's great.
But even in states, I would just say where maybe they didn't weren't taking action at this time. I mean, people are sympathetic, they're struggling. I mean, this is a complicated issue. I'm just if it was easy, it would have been solved, right? Like this is not an easy issue. And I think everyone wants I didn't chapter leaders, everyone wants us to, make sure that there aren't barriers, right? Like, but how to go about doing that, do you know what I mean? And doing it in a way that, it doesn't do more harm, people are struggling with what that looks like.
Absolutely. There is a lot of layers to it for sure. Like I know you mentioned like licensure models, regulatory bodies, governmental makeup, cross state legislation, all of that. And I know you just kind of said that it is hard to, figure out that path and that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
do you think about what a realistic path could look like? How do we start the challenge of like navigating this? I'm sure that's the $1 million question, obviously,
Yeah. Um,
personal perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's like anything else. I mean, personally, I think, the disparities didn't surprise me. I mean, the report came out and, it got people like, up in arm, but I actually wasn't that surprised. By the report because we see disparities in, lots of places and testing, right, has been, a controversial issue in college admissions and, other professions for years. So for me, I think dialogue is important. So I applaud you for doing this. Like the one thing that we need to do is we need to keep people at the table and we need to have a lot of dialogue because this isn't, you know, let's be honest, if we do away with the test, there are still going to be disparities, right? There are disparities. It costs money to go to graduate school. There are access issues, whether it's pay to placement. There are. I wrote an article about that. Is that this is not the only? It's become sort of a lightning rod issue, but there are lots of other ways in which people are prevented, you know what I mean, from entering the profession. And so what I would say is we need to talk. We need to look at this as I disagree that just doing away with the test would, solve all our problems. I don't think that at all. And so I think we need to look at the profession, higher ed, do you know what I mean, licensure, just everything uh, carefully, right? And chip away at these problems because they're not going to be solved that easily. They're just not.
Absolutely. And I like you, I think that dialogue is super duper important because a lot of people just simply sometimes don't know what they don't know until someone else is in that room to tell them about it. So I think that's super true. And even just what you said about needing to undo that, because like if we do away with the test, then yeah, there is still that guard of people not being able to get into grad school, still underrepresented like admission, still like not having enough money, still not this, not that, not XYZ. So there is it's a whole domino effect and cyclical just of how big the situation is or at least
Yeah.
just tackling it. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think yeah.
And we have to be careful. I mean, it doesn't fall against like racial law. Like I have talked to many people of color who are also a little worried, let's say about alternate pathways or eliminating the test because licensure and professionalization results in higher salaries. And so we want to be careful that the people that we're trying to help, do you know what I mean, we don't hurt. I just was talking to someone the other day where they live in a state where there's an alternate pathway, meaning you do not need to test. And in a job application, they hold the license, but the employer asked them whether they had gotten that license through testing or the alternate pathway. And again, you know, I don't know why, but they were very worried about that, because we, may have people being discriminated against because of an alternate pathway or not getting access to jobs. Do you know what I mean? Because employers are, looking at, testing as being the standard. So we have to, or the test is going to be used in the compact. So we don't want people not being able to practice across state lines. So this is a very complicated issue. I think we're all committed. I'm fully committed to making sure that people have access, but I think there's lots of things that we need to think about, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? And that's I think part of the getting back to the article, that was, part of the issue is we can't take action in isolation. And that, that's what I think the chapter directors recognize.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point about the alternative path and how that feels to a person of color because like I feel like I was always raised with the notion from my parents that you're gonna always have to work 3, 4, 5 times
Yes.
than your white counterparts. And
Yes.
so if I'm in their position and I'm already, working super hard, whatever, and I didn't take that direct path to licensure, that's gonna weigh on my head way more. Are they looking at me because of that? This plus the fact that I'm a POC, like that
Yes.
I totally understand that, and I could totally see
Yes.
why that makes the issue so much more complicated. I
Yes.
yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up.
And sorry, I'm an academic, so but I had a social worker, they weren't my student, but come to me, and actually it was a person of color, and she was very concerned because she said, "I know if I do this, I can, it's an alternative for me, but I, am gonna be held down. I'm not gonna have the same opportunities, and I wanna make sure," do you know what I mean, "that I have access to the compact, or I don't want this." So she was actually testing in a state in which she didn't need to test.
Mhm.
And so again, those are real experiences, and we need to recognize those as well. And so, as I said, unfortunately, it's not easy, but I enjoyed doing this, the study because, with first of all, working with my my team here and, my colleagues, because it really showed how complex this issue is. And what we said in the article is there is not a one size fits all. Like, this is not what's going to work in Texas might not work in Vermont. Do you know what I mean? Or is not going to work in California. And so because each state is different, they had to take a different approach.
Yeah, so that's so very yeah, just very real, and I just appreciate you bringing that up. That's awesome. Kind of wanting to switch gears a little bit
Sure.
back to more like the data that kind of led you down this path, the pass rate analysis data, and how for a while that data was hard to receive. It wasn't being released. And I noticed that you had said that the pressure, not you, but like colleagues, on the
Mhm.
article had said that you noticed that the pressure rose after the murder of George Floyd. I'm curious what you think kind of sparked in people for people to be like, hey, now we really need this. This is something that we really want to see.
Yeah. So I've been, maybe that's why I wasn't surprised. I've been doing, licensure prep for decades, and so I anecdotally, do you know what I mean, would see that some people would struggle more than others. So it wasn't a scientific study, it wasn't, the actual data, but I think people whether English wasn't their first language. I mean, it's not just race, right? Older people, maybe people with disabilities. So obviously there would be disparities. And unfortunately, and I think that's part of the reason people are sort of so outraged now is that they were kind of told, well, there weren't disparities when asked, when they asked ASWB. And so they feel a little bit betrayed. And I would say the same thing, about George Floyd too, is like, you know, people who, police are there to protect us, supposedly. And so, I mean, there's many crimes, things that occur disproportionately against people of color. But when you see like the police who, we're told to trust, you know what I mean? Like, we're outraged, right? And so I think, in some ways, I'm not a clinician, but I think in some ways that has really fueled, some of the way, you know what I mean, people feel. It's like, yeah, we can't trust the police, and we can't trust our own profession, so it's some transference, if you will, right? Like, that's gotten us like up in arms, that something, because we often can't fix the greater, systemic racism. We want to, but we can't, right? Like, we try, I don't think we should stop, but so, I think people are saying like, they're transferring all that passion, do you know what I mean, and that to this issue, and trying to say, what can we do? And so it represents something bigger, I think, for people. Again, that's my armchair analysis here, but it represents, and I think people, George Floyd, again, there are many incidents. I mean, this is not new, but it sort of was like a racial awakening, and so I think that has really, spurred into action lots of things, but as I said, this has sort of become like a lightning rod issue, if you will, because, you know, if we can't make greater change, we're kind of like, let's do something in the profession. I wrote an article about like the bigger, as I said, because I think, we see students of color, borrowing more money. We see lots of other disparities. And I guess my getting away from the research a little, but I hope we just aren't putting all of our energy into this one issue and ignoring maybe the bigger, do you know what I mean, more systemic problems in our profession. So, hopefully there's lots of problems to go around. So, we've got to make sure we focus on them more broadly.
Truly, truly. Yeah. I totally agree. And I think you made such great points throughout that. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think just having that trust broken, like you said, between maybe not even broken, but just a little bit, distance
Yeah.
more from people in the police, then that makes them, yeah, turn to the profession and be like, oh my gosh, we need to, yeah, I totally agree. I think that was a perfect way to kind of connect the two.
And unfortunately, I see this a lot. I mean, I see racism in our own, profession. I hate to say that, just like I see ableism in class. We are people. And so, I think we have a lot to do even in social work, right? To dismantle, and check ourselves. That's this is just one issue, that or one, I wouldn't say one issue, but just, the testing disparities is again just an example of lots of other things and lots of work that we need to do. We all, we should never stop.
Absolutely. I 100% agree, for sure. Yeah, I think that was amazing. I feel like you kind of encapsulated all the specific points that I wanted to hit throughout this. I know at the beginning we mentioned if there was anything outside of the article that you wanted to bring in and connect or maybe
Yeah.
speak on something else in general. Please let me know if we can move towards something else and if there's anything else you'd like to say or talk about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been doing work about, testing, licensure testing for a long time. And, the special issue, I think its value hopefully is to get people to talk. Do you know what I mean? And to be, but again, I this is I would just say, I hope this isn't just like the issue of, I think we need commitment, and I think people are committed, looking at this. And again, I don't think it's as easy as alternate pathways or eliminate and I mean, there's a lot of different things that we could do. And the best way to do it is by continuing to do research, by continuing dialogues like this, right? And we're only going to get through this if we're together. And unfortunately, I hope I continue. We could be a model. Let's just put it this way for the country of dialogue and working together, which I think is important. And we need to be careful, that we don't splinter and that we learn and we move forward. So that's kind of my message of hope. I got to have a message of hope.
I
It's
mean, I feel
important.
like if any industry field in the world is gonna further this conversation, it's definitely gonna be social workers. I feel like
I hope
I've
so.
been in this role such a short time, but even just learning about what people in IU are doing and the research and the conversations that they're having and what they're trying to work towards is just so inspiring. And I'm like, wow, this is again, like it's just a field where I'm like, if anybody's going to be working towards something, it's the social workers. And like you said, that dialogue piece is super important. Continuing, research like this is super important. Just continuing to be in the ears of people and having these kinds of conversations are just like, yeah.
Because there's gonna be other issues. I mean, I've been in the field, decades, so if this isn't gonna be the only issue, right? Like, we've got AI, I mean, we're just
Mm.
right? Like, there are so many issues and disparities. I mean, they've existed, right? Like, when you look, my lifetime, and they will continue to exist, right? Like, I don't the idea that there will not be people left out or, that we won't have our isms or whatever, I pray, but I don't think that's gonna happen, right? They'll just be different ones or they'll manifest themselves in new ways. And so we have to, I think, take a look at this and try not to perpetuate the past, right? And try to think about, what can we do? And again, if things were easy, they would happen.
Mhm.
So it isn't easy. But I also wanna make sure that those who are impacted are at the table. Like, I represent, I'm very aware I'm a white woman, and so it's very important, right, like, as we move forward, that we have people, who represent those groups where there are disparities at the table. Do you know what I mean? And they're part of the decision making, because I think sometimes, and I see this as well, when we're trying to come up with solutions, we're looking around and the people who are making the decisions aren't necessarily the people affected. And One thing that it wasn't really part of, well, it did come out in the research, so I feel confident, but to think that every person of color, once the test eliminated, that's just not right. And so we need to make sure that we represent the diversity, that is the diversity of our profession. Not all people of color feel the same way, right? Like, they don't all have they don't all think the path forward should be the same. So we have to, you know, we've got work to do.
Yeah, it really is that combination of having people who the issues are affecting, look like that in those
Yeah,
rooms. I completely agree with that, but it's also both of us together because sometimes people of color even get
that's
in
true.
those rooms and they start talking to, white people about these
Yes,
issues and they're not being heard, they're not being seen because,
I agree with you.
people automatically won't trust what we have to say or what, people in that
I
position
agree.
will have to say. And so it really is that combined effort of, unfortunately, it's just like it's like
Yeah,
if they see a person that looks like them talking about this, they'll be like, "Okay, maybe I should care about this. Maybe I should be thinking about this." So it's definitely that combined effort, and I like that you kind of brought up both sides to speak to.
yeah. In the classroom, I talk about like a shared power. Like, I view myself as like empowering the students, and I like to do things and maybe have power in my own university a little bit, because that helps promote, right, like, students and their issues. And I think what you bring up is so important, is this has to be a partnership. And if someone who looks like me can advance the profession, or then great. But I got to make sure that I'm not making assumptions, because sometimes we do, that uh others would, want something. Like, I think initially when I started this research about disparities, I was like, oh, well, people who are affected, they would just say, like, get rid of the test, you know what I mean? Or go on. But I've learned that that isn't the case either. It's complicated. And so, we need to make sure that there's room at the table for everybody.
Even in itself is such a monumental kind of like shift to take place. So I'm super happy
Yeah.
that that happened for you, and I think that's honestly, I probably would have thought something similar going into it as
Yeah.
like that. People just would have been like, let's do away with it. But a lot of times people just want to be at that same level, and it's like it's not about let's get rid of it and let's do this, this, and this. Like, can we just make it so we can all participate and we're all feeling, spoken. So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I would say, maybe one of the most, like, profound people that I've, like, met in my journey here is this idea of, I think what we need to do is think about how can we make preparation, affordable, equitable? How can we make sure, you know what I'm saying, that everyone has access, and the same opportunities? And so I will say, the positive about this is that I think some schools, including your own, have really taken a look at how they can make sure that, not just people who can afford materials, you know what I mean, have access to them. And so there's been a lot more effort to, to support people in this licensure journey, which I didn't see the same. It was kind of like, well, people we'll just give them the degree, and you know what I mean, they'll kind of go out and do it. But I think we've realized that, you know, the journey isn't always fair, for people. And so, if you don't have money for a prep book or a course, or, you don't have money for the test or something like that, that can leave you out. And so I'm, seeing people who are also stepping up and providing more support.
Awesome. I love to hear it.
Thank you for the opportunity, and, just thank you for everything that you're doing.
Absolutely. I loved learning more about this, and again, it's been so just like refreshing to see so many people in social work who are so passionate about topics like these and wanting to bring light to situations like this and just constantly hinting at, how large these racial disparities can be and how many facets of our life they affect each and every day. So,
I
yeah,
mean,
I just
to believe that the isms are not here, right? Like, see them, ableism, we see these, right? Like
Mhm.
the world has lots of, you know, unfortunately, we're not going
Yeah.
to be put out of business here in
Yeah.
social work. So
Right.
we got to fight the good fight here.
Definitely. Thank you again so much, Dawn. This